I'd like to start with a kavanah, an intention. We gather together in despair over the plight of those caught in the brutality of war in Israel and Gaza. And while we've witnessed horrors on one side, we fear for the retaliatory violence, despairing for our brothers and sisters in Israel, reliving past traumas of our people. We gather despite our pain and numbness, seeking wholeness in the path of Torah. May we find the peace and the wholeness, the shalom and the shlemut that we seek. So we'll do the bracha together, la'asok b'divrei Torah, Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech ha'olam, asher kiddushanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Amen.
Amen.
So I usually open our study with an opening question that is designed to bring out the theme of the week's study. But I think given the events of the last week, I guess I'd like to create a little space here for people to share, if they're willing, where they are kind of mentally as we come to the group together today. I'd like to just lay out three things. One, be relatively brief, although we don't have that many people on the call, so you can go on a little bit, couple of minutes. We're here to discuss feelings, not facts, and so I don't want to get into the very complicated issues with regard to the situation. And I guess third, and this is echoing a message that Rabbi Noyo sent around, is to be gentle with each other. There is rawness right now. There's trauma. We don't know where each other is coming from on the spectrum of politics and emotion, and so just keep that in mind with regard to your remarks. So, anyone would like to lead off? Go ahead, Sarah.
I can certainly start. Okay, I will just focus it in on one thing, to be brief. And that is my great disappointment with the Boston public school system. We've heard nothing from the higher ups, which I don't know if I would have noticed so much before, except that within hours of every other world tragedy that has occurred in the last, as long as I've been in the BPS system with my kids, over 10 years, we've heard within hours. And now it's been a week, and I wrote to the superintendent and the communications office saying straight up, I have no political agenda. I'm wondering if there's going to be an acknowledgement of what's happening, that our kids are, even though there was low credibility, that our kids are safe on Friday, or at least that you are aware of the situation. And that just to acknowledge that there are many families hurting. I didn't mention Israel. I didn't mention Gaza. I didn't mention Muslims or Jews. And I haven't heard anything. And I also reached out to the principals. One was pretty cold. Just said, "Oh, okay, I'll let someone know you're concerned. We're safe here." And the other, who was a new principal, was incredibly sweet. And I honestly think he's just been waiting for guidance from the higher ups and hasn't gotten any. And he sent a message out almost within a couple hours of my message. And I'm sure other parents message as well. And he was so earnest and sincere. And actually that was heartwarming. He said he learned from this, and there should have been something anyway. That's one of many things I've been thinking about, how the silence has been startling to me. I've heard about it before, but I've never experienced it quite so dramatically.
Yeah. It's amazing, just as a sort of a control, right, between all of the other events that have merited a response and this nothing. And so you must be turning this over in your mind, trying to come up with the conclusion of what this is about.
I mean, I know even with our own community, how you even introduced this is incredibly a volatile, sensitive subject. We all have different feelings, opinions, translations of the facts. And I get that. And I know that some, or I should say, I believe that some Jews would be angry that I don't care if they use the word terrorist attack. I don't care if they use the word Jews. I want an acknowledgement of suffering. And I realize even me saying that is controversial, right? From amongst different communities. But the silence was and even members of my community at the school, all these self-righteous, white liberal women, especially, who are so loud about so many things, and then just to disappear is, it's alarming to me.
Yeah, yeah. All right. Well, thank you for sharing that and being willing to go first.
Thank you, Richard.
Anyone else?
Hi, everyone. I'm David. I haven't had a chance to meet everybody, so just thank you for welcoming me to this group. And I guess I should say I apologize in advance. I don't think I'm going to get to stay all the way until 9:30. As far as the topic goes, you don't know me well. I don't have strong connections to people in Israel, but coincidentally, I happened to be on a call yesterday with a colleague who was in Israel with his family, actually in the south of Israel, yesterday. And so I just want to share one little bit from my conversation with him. And his kind of attitude about things was that this is the beginning of a long struggle, I guess I'll say, or war. Whatever it is that's happening, it's not going to be over soon. And I think that I hadn't, until that conversation, I don't think that had really sunk in for me. And I think it makes me very sad. Among other emotions, it makes me very sad, because I think as time goes on, it will be corrosive, and this sort of undercurrent, I shouldn't say undercurrent, I don't know, steady encounter with devastation and war and sadness will be hard on all of us and on our society. So I guess I'm just sharing sort of the where I am is grappling with the idea that this is not a crisis of the moment. This is the beginning of a long, horrible chapter.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, David, for sharing that. And I think it's very well put. And I'm sure many people feeling the same thing, being ready to steel themselves. But anyone else? Yes,
I'm Nancy
yeah.
Berliner.
Yeah.
I mean, it's all just obvious, I guess, but when you have a war, there are sides, and it's just so complex, and it's the situation. What happened in Israel is the worst that can happen in war, but then there's going to be just so many people who are innocent, and all anybody really wants is peace, and we get caught up with these leaders for whom war is their life. It's the way they keep themselves in power. And I don't have any wise words. It's just very, very distressing. And
Thank you, Nancy. Yeah, no solutions, just recognition of the complexity and the horror. Anyone else want to contribute?
It's Susanna. Hi, everyone. Our whole house has been incredibly stressed. We have a lot of family in Israel, but many of them have been mobilized, and we don't know where they are, but we're getting constant WhatsApp messages from their family and videos. And I have a nephew who immigrated to Israel 2 years ago, who's young man, and he's terrified. He's been running back and forth to bomb shelters, but he almost went to that concert. And he has friends who were killed. And as a human rights activist, I've been receiving also queries about what message the organization I used to work for should be sending out right now. with regards to what's happening on both sides. And of course, and I, 2 members of my family, my husband and my daughter, are dual citizens. So our emotions are really raw, and we haven't been sleeping well, and we're terribly worried about what's ahead. And like David said, we're bracing ourselves for a very long period of this. We're trying to give comfort to our many cousins, but it's really hard. And they send us back messages of different people, world leaders, showing solidarity with them because they feel kind of like Sarah, maybe very afraid of silence, and they feel isolated and they feel alone. But so every time they see somebody speaking out, especially understanding their pain and the pain of everyone in the area, they feel heartened. And so I feel like it's important right now to, I mean, I've seen also a lot of fighting within the Jewish community, which is very painful, and fighting with words. And I feel like I like the message we received from Rabbi Noyo of, this is not the time for the whataboutism or the politics, but it's a time to understand the danger and the fear and the pain. And of course, it's extremely sad. And I just hope that there will be solutions ahead that will end this bloodshed.
Thank you, Susanna. From your mouth to God's ears. I'll just share very briefly that for me, the complexity is overwhelming, that there are no good solutions, and the fact that everybody in this seems to be a pawn of larger forces. And that to me is what's really heartbreaking, because those larger forces are, overwhelming in the face of what any individual citizen or group of citizens wants to try to do. And so to find the will and the strength to continue on in the face of that is also difficult, and it will be a long haul. Anyone else before we get started?
I just fear for their safety, and I know how horrified they are about the whole thing, and it's just, the whole thing is just really scary, and I don't know where it'll go, and I don't know how long it will last, and all those questions are also really scary too.
Emily, thank you. I'm going to start, as I do, with an overview of the Parsha, and everybody knows Bereishit very well, so I'm not going to go into it in a lot of detail. But we do begin with the story of creation. God creates the world in 6 days out of a formless void. Tohu vavohu, one of the great expressions of the Torah. The best example of the challenges of translation into English, Everett Fox, who has done a beautiful translation of the Torah, and one of the things Everett Fox tries to do is get the poetry of the Hebrew into the English, and he talks about the challenges of doing that because they're very different languages. But he said if he could, he would translate Tohu Vavohu as limbo akimbo. It's just a little bit too comical for the context, but that's Tohu Vavohu, out of which the world was created. And then after this first creation story in chapter 1, we have the second creation story in chapter 2. And then, you're invited to scrutinize for similarities and differences. Woman is created as helper by man's side. Man and women are tested, forbidden to eat of the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. They fail this test, goaded by the snake. They are cursed, banished from the garden. Then the first murder, a fratricide, brother killing brother. Another reminder that we are created in the image of God, and a third telling of the creation narrative. And then at the end, humankind turns to the bad, and God regrets this creation, deciding to destroy and start anew with this curiously named figure, Noach, a name symbolizing comfort and regret. And the flood arrives next week. In liturgical time, we've just come through the high holidays and Sukkot. And after this burst of holidays, we will enter this week, the month of Cheshvan, known as Mar Cheshvan, Bitter Cheshvan. and it's named this because of its total absence of holidays. But we will still have the weekly holiness of Shabbat. We rewind the Torah to the beginning. In the analog world of Torah, this is not a click of a button, but rather a long process of rolling in physical space. This is the time of Hagbah for lefties only, with all that parchment wound around the left pole, waiting to unfurl week by week. Just a brief word of context about this portion. We're at the beginning of it all, beginning with the letter Bet, pointedly the second letter of the alphabet. There is an implication, perhaps, that something has come before. And it's true that there's a midrash that God created many, many, many worlds before God was willing to let this one go and be the first creation. And the word Bereishit, as the grammarians will tell you, is in construct form, which means it's required to be attached to a noun. It means the beginning of something. And the question is of what? It's a riddle to ponder, posed by the Torah's very first word, containing hints of an unknowable past and an unknowable future. So we're going to go to the end of the first chapter, which is the first creation narrative about the 6 days. Sarah, would you mind reading for us in English verses 26 through 31?
And God said, "Let us make humankind in our image, after our likeness. They shall rule the fish of the sea, the birds of the sky, the cattle, the whole earth, and all the creeping things that creep on earth." And God created humankind in the divine image, creating it in the image of God, creating them male and female. God blessed them, and God said to them, "Be fertile and increase, fill the earth and master it, and rule the fish of the sea, the birds of the sky, and all the living things that creep on earth." God said, "See, I give you every seed-bearing plant that is upon all the earth, and every tree that has seed-bearing fruit. They shall be yours for food. And to all the animals on land, to all the birds of the sky, and to everything that creeps on earth, in which there is the breath of life, I give all the green plants for food." And it was so. And God saw all that had been made, and found it very good. And there was evening and there was morning, the 6th day.
Okay, thank you. So does this narrative put humankind at the pinnacle of creation or not?
I've definitely heard this argument before. And I have a hard time understanding why pinnacle necessarily means destruction. We're to care for it. So maybe there is a sense of being in charge, I guess, to a certain degree, but through the years, what I've witnessed is it seems more there to be more destruction of it, and we have the right to destroy as opposed to the obligation to take care of.
Yes, I think it's very true that I guess you're going to this sort of power and dominion aspect of what humankind has been given. And I guess that's sort of presuming from this narrative that humankind is put at the pinnacle. Is that how you read the narrative? Yeah. Does anyone have a? Yeah.
Yes, and I'd like to translate it a different, or interpret it a different, side by side, as opposed to a hierarchy. But yeah.
Yeah, I'm sorry. So when you say side by side, what do you mean?
It's presented that God put these things here for us to be able to thrive and to nourish us mentally and physically, and instead of taking advantage of that, being able to help continue its glory, like providing for it so it can provide for us, as opposed to overrunning something.
Yeah.
Makes sense?
So that basically there's a reciprocity.
Yeah.
That's built in, not a hierarchy.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, I think that's good. It's a fair point, and commentators have been on both sides of the issue. So I thank you for bringing both out at the same time. Any other thoughts?
It doesn't leave a lot of room for humankind to still have something to accomplish. It kind of infantilizes the humankind. You've been given it's not God as partner setting humans up to create, develop, fulfill, but rather to just proceed with what has already been laid out for them. And so it's all here, it's done. God looked and saw it was good, it's sort of over with, as opposed to a story of sort of ongoing creation in which humans do more, use what God has provided to become something greater than just biological determinants, creatures that creep and that fly. The master them doesn't really offer very much as a sort of what's next for humankind. So I think in some ways it can be very limiting. And when we think about, God, sometimes God is the immature parent, emotional, limiting, constraining, and sometimes God is sort of opening up the opportunities for human. This feels like a relatively limiting chapter or passage.
I feel like it definitely can be read that way. And yet at the same time, there's the implicit question of, what's the responsible stewardship of being put in control, and how do you exercise control? So it's interesting that it's got those implications, and then on second thought, it could be a little bit different. The commentators have fallen on both sides of this question, and one of the things they comment on is the fact that at the end of the sixth day, creation is pronounced very good, and the prior day is just good. And one of the commentators says the reason for that is because the creation of humankind, it wasn't very good. And when you finally had the capstone put at the top of the pyramid, then it could be very good. But there's a commentator, Rabbeinu Bachya, who is really just one of the most wonderful commentators, probably about 14th century Spain, and one of the people, the commentators who brought Kabbalah to the forefront of his Torah commentary. And he says very good only works because that's when creation was complete, and when all the interlocking pieces came together with the challenge to harmonize them, and everything depending on everything else. And it's that interrelationship that is what's beautiful and very good. And so you do have the commentators coming in on both sides of it. Just to ask, is it necessarily the case that the last is the pinnacle? What's the counter argument to that?
That the last was the smallest little piece to get stuck.
Yeah, and maybe of lesser importance.
Yeah.
And what's the first creation? Anybody remember what the first
Light.
thing?
Light.
Let there be light. And so the poets, would certainly jump in and say, light, that it represents the divine, represents holiness. There's the whole Kabbalistic theology about the heavenly light, the divine light, not being able to be contained and shattering the vessels, and all of that Lurianic Kabbalah. So in a sense, the very greatest thing was did first, and maybe that says something about humankind. And there's a passage from the Talmud that says that man was created on the sixth day, because if we get too proud and haughty, God can say the mosquito is created before you. It was either Sarah or David that was talking about this dominion and this power, and if it destroys, it's no superpower. These days, I really feel the need for a theology that does not put us at the center. And I call it species humility. I don't know if people are familiar with Robin Wall Kimmerer. She's a botanist, Native American, member of the Potawatomi tribe. She just won a MacArthur Genius Grant, recognizing a lifetime of work in trying to fuse science and indigenous wisdom. And one of her loves is the study of mosses. This kind of humble, simple little plant, maybe the least sentient form of life you could imagine. And she describes the power of their smallness that enables them to live in a crack in the sidewalk or on the face of a cliff. They subsist in the interface between air and land. The stillness of air allows them to hydrate on the morning dew. They can be produced by spores or by cloning. They've been around for 400 million years and span 22,000 species. They can lose up to 98% of their moisture and restore themselves even after 40 years after a quick bath in water. And they've ensured their survival by making themselves useful to humans. So use them to clean fish, as diapers, as sanitary napkins. They've endured multiple severe climate changes that extinguished many species. So there's great power in their tininess and in their modest needs. And so the issue of whether we are at the center of the world is fundamentally important as we think about our stewardship of the earth after enduring the hottest summer in 100,000 years. There's a midrash that expounds on a verse from Ecclesiastes. See the work of God, for who can mend what he has warped.
When the Holy One, blessed be he, created Adam, the first man, he took him and showed him all the trees in the Garden of Eden. And he said to him, see my creations, how beautiful and exemplary they are. Everything I created for you. Make certain that you do not ruin and destroy my world. As if you destroy it, there will be no one to mend it after you.
Thank you. That's on that theme of, of our power and the responsibility from it. The other thing that I wanted to just highlight, one that really spoke to me this week, actually is this next sentence that is the kind of a third creation narrative. So chapter 1 is the first one, chapter 2 is the second one, and then there's this verse, this is the record of Adam's line. When God created humankind, it was made in the likeness of God. So the first time we heard about the likeness of God was when Sarah read the original creation narrative, and there was this reference to Tselem Elohim, the image of God. And then this one talks about Demut Elohim, also is kind of the likeness or the image of God. So this is a theme, and I'm wondering, what does it mean to people when they hear that humankind was created in the image of God? Small question.
I think it gives a lot of responsibility to mankind. He's created in the image of God.
Responsibility to, in what way?
Well, like in the chapter before that I read, it made me think of climate change and taking care of the earth.
I definitely feel a sense of responsibility. Maybe one of the questions is to actually interpret what does it mean to be in the image of God. I mean, it's such a big question, and it's not easy to answer. Yeah, David.
Well, I think I get stuck a little bit on the sort of like the God as parent framework, and so with that said, I think God is presented as creator, and so to be in the image of God is to be also a creator or capable of creation, and that maybe differentiates humans from other things that were created in Bereishit. And so to be in the likeness of God is to be a creator, but I think there's tension there. So in the passage we just looked at, God says, I created all this, I made this beautiful playground for you, don't mess it up, right? The only thing you can do is destroy it. It doesn't say, now experience the fullness of humanity, now go make something even greater than, what I've set you up. It is not I've set you up for success, it's I've given you everything you need, don't mess it up. And I think it's also, maybe you're headed here, but there's I don't know if irony is the right word, but I'll say it's an irony, right? God says, I made this, don't destroy it. And then shortly thereafter, God goes and destroys it, right, with the flood. And so, anyways, that's what I hear I think there's this tension between, are humans like God in that they can create, they can make something more than was there before, or are they the creatures of God like other creatures who are limited in what they can do in the world that God created?
I really appreciate you highlighting the concept of creativity and being a creator, and that one way in which we are in the image of God is that we have the creative capacity that God has as a creator. And I guess, Emily, going to your point, the word responsibility, power, and how are we going to use it? Touching on the themes that you brought up, Genesis chapter 6, it's at the very end of Genesis. Adonai saw how great was human wickedness on earth, how every plan devised by the human mind was nothing but evil all the time. And Adonai regretted having made humankind on earth with a sorrowful heart. Adonai said, I will blot out from earth humankind whom I created, humans together with beasts, creeping things, and birds of the sky, for I regret that I made them. What I find really interesting is if you take a look at the 5th sentence, the translation that says every plan devised by the human mind, the Hebrew for that is kol yetzer machshavot libo. Kol is all, yetzer is a Hebrew word root means creativity. And so our creativity was spent on coming up with evil. And I think that notion of God's profound disappointment that having endowed us with creative capacity, this is what we use it for, that could not be abided. It goes back to kind of that sense of responsibility. Go ahead. Was someone going to say something?
I was just going to say, in regards to the earlier sentence and man being created in God's image, when I think of the Torah, historically, different parts of it were written at different times. And I wonder if this was one of the very early pieces, this early Genesis bit. And if we think of it really literally, of man being made in God's image, I'm just thinking, if that is also related to a very early forms of religion, and I'm just thinking, it makes me think of Abraham and Terah making statues, and I don't know, that's just what it brought to mind, something very physical.
Yeah, well, it is so interesting, Nancy, that you mention the notion of the creations of ancient peoples, right? Because that's God in man's image, right? I mean,
Exactly. Exactly.
Yeah, always, but
yes,
that's where you're going with
that's
that,
where
right?
I was going. Yeah.
The other interesting thing to point out, I guess, just linguistically, the phrase Tselem Elokim, Tselem, the image, embedded in the word Tselem is the word Tzel, which means shadow. And it really talks about the intimate relationship between a light and an object and its shadow, the extent to which the shadow is kind of an outline of the object, but doesn't quite fill in the object, and what's the relationship and the congruence between the shadow and the object, yet they're very close to each other. It's really a beautiful poetical symbol embedded in Tselem Elokim. And there is this interplay back and forth of who's defining the image. So thank you for mentioning that. So I wanted to go to just one other aspect of this narrative, and it goes back to that sentence. This is the record of Adam's line: when God created humankind, it was made in the likeness of God. And that was chapter 5, verse 1. This sentence actually figures in one of the most famous debates of Jewish theology. If I were to ask you what our tradition says is the fundamental principle of the Torah, what would you say? Like, if there was a one takeaway, there's a famous story about it too.
Do unto others as you would do.
There you go, right? That's the thing you always hear about there's the famous story of the guy who comes to Hillel and Shammai and says, teach me the Torah while I stand on one leg. And Shammai basically throws him out. He was very kind of imperious. Hillel, who was known for his loving, compassion, took the person at his word and said, love your neighbor as yourself. Everything else elaborates on that. Now go study. Well, it turns out that this sentence that we just read is part of a debate between Rabbi Akiva, the very famous, who lived 200 years after Hillel, who said, love your neighbor as yourself, being the key teaching. And there was a debate between Rabbi Akiva and his pupil Ben Azai. And the two of them were debating what was the most important principle of Torah. And Rabbi Akiva said, love your neighbor as yourself. And Ben Azai says, this is the book of the descent of man. Chapter 5, verse 1. Why did Ben Azai feel that this, on its face, who could argue with love your neighbor as yourself? Ben Azai did not feel that was the right first principle to distill. What's inadequate about love your neighbor as yourself?
Well, God's not in it.
Okay, right. One could say first principles, God ought to be in it. And God actually is in the second one. Nancy?
Also, it just doesn't account for all the horrible impulses that exist.
And when you say the horrible impulses, are you talking about more generally the evil inclination, or?
Yeah, in humans.
Right. Well, it may not be a comprehensive view of the human condition, but as something to aim for. Let's just think
It's something to aim for. Yeah.
Something to aim for. Still, Ben Azai did not feel that love your neighbor as yourself quite qualified. What's deficient about that as a guiding principle?
Oh, I see. Well, some people don't love themselves.
Ha! True. Very true. And so that means you should have the same hatred for your neighbor as you have for yourself. If you're one of those self-loving people, that's a problem. Okay, one subtlety that's buried in here is, first of all, it starts with self-love, right, as the measure, which, right, if it's love your neighbor as yourself and self is the paradigm, there are people who could say, well, there's an egotism buried at the heart of it. But the other thing is it requires a definition of neighbor, and that is a boundary, right? So is that saying that you should love all people or only your neighbor? And that's where Ben Azai comes in and says, everybody is created in the image of God. And that's the greater principle, because it puts aside differences, it puts aside tribalism, it puts aside the self and the egotism that, it's not that you were created in the image of God, but we all were created in the image of God. So
Rich, are you drawing, maybe in the language, are you drawing a distinction between, say, like neighbor and stranger? I mean, there's lots about being welcoming to strangers, being generous, and I wouldn't have distinguished neighbor from stranger or other, and we could even expand the other could include other species, other generations, the future, an expansive definition of other. I didn't think of neighbor as being limiting in any way.
Yeah, that's interesting. I guess to me, neighbor is almost a kind of a proximity, right? I mean, that's what it is. That there's some degree of connection that's behind neighbor, and I think you're right to point out the stranger, right? I mean, there are different words that could have been substituted in there, and this one has at least a little bit more of a connotation of connection of sorts, whereas stranger sort of denies connection. This should be beyond connection. Even the stranger is someone to love.
But when a stranger comes, you bring out your best food, you defer, like you are even better than, you treat them even better than you would treat yourself. So I mean, I can't parse the language. I don't know the text, but I think that the instruction is to, particularly with those with whom you don't have a connection, to assume the best, be the most generous, maybe be the most godlike.
Yeah. And it's true that Abraham, for example, was known for his hospitality to guests, right? So, you can definitely find proof texts kind of all over the place. And I guess I'm zeroing in on how these two rabbis used these proof texts and where they went with them. But I appreciate you bringing up the various different exhibits that could be brought in this argument. I wanted to show you a really lovely story that I came across about this whole notion of the image of God. So this is a story about someone who, so the Baal Shem Tov is the one who founded Hasidism back in the early 18th century. Have you read yet, Nancy?
Nope.
Could you read the story about Reb Nachman Kosover?
Yeah, Reb Nachum Kosover was a friend of the Baal Shem Tov who believed that the proper way to remain close to God was to constantly contemplate the four-letter name YHWH, to see the letters of God's name ever before him. He was a preacher, and when he looked out at his audience, he was able to see God's name in every face. But then times changed. The preacher was forced to become a merchant in order to survive. In the marketplace, with the rapid pace of all the buying and selling, he found it harder to always concentrate on the name of God. So he hired a special assistant to follow him wherever he went, whose only job was to be a reminder. Whenever he looked at his assistant's face, he would remember the name of God.
I love that. You wonder what the guy looked like that could provoke this image of God. Sometimes these debates in our tradition can feel pretty dry and academic. And then we have a week like we've just had where the principle of who is our brother or sister and the question of how far should our compassion extend becomes very tangible. As the days unfold and we witness the cruelties of the attack and the response, our hearts will break because if we're being honest with ourselves, Ben Azai has the more morally defensible and upright position. We are all created equal. In the image of God, all suffering counts. I'm feeling myself compelled in light of the suffering and death that we've experienced in the past week. For those who are willing and able to recite it, I would like to do the Mourner's Kaddish together in recognition of the many who died. Yitgadal v'yitkadash shemei Rabbah.
Amen.
V'yamar tivrach v'yutei v'yamlich malchutei v'chayechon v'ramechon v'chayei d'chol Beit Yisrael v'agalav zman kariv v'yamru Amen.
Amen.
Yehei shmei Rabbam barach le'olam v'mei almai. Yitbarach v'yishtabach
Yitpar,
Yitramam Yitzeh Yitadar Yitalev Yitalal Shmei Dekudisha Berchu Kol Berchata V'Shirata Tushbechata V'Chamata Na'amiran B'Yamah
Amen.
Yehei Shlomo Min Shemaya V'Chaim Aleinu V'Yakol Yisrael V'Yamru
Amen.
Amen.
Seh Shalom V'Marmav Kuyach Shalom Aleinu Kol Yisrael V'Yakol Yisrael V'Yamru Amen.
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 I want to thank everyone for gathering together today. It can be a little bit difficult to know when to carry on with things like Torah study, but I think it's nice to be able to gather in community to be able to do that, and I appreciate you joining this morning.
Thank you, Rich.
Yeah,
Thank you very much.
Shabbat shalom.
Thank you, Rich.
Shalom.
Shabbat shalom. Have a great week. Bye bye.